We now move on to the next item of business, which is a statement by the First Minister on Scotland's place in Europe. The First Minister will take questions at the end of the statement, so there should be no interruptions or interventions. I call on Nicola Sturgeon.
Presiding Officer, let me begin today by expressing my condolences and sympathies to all those affected by last night's appalling attack in Berlin. Our thoughts are very much with all those who lost their lives, those who sustained injuries and those who lost loved ones. I'm sure Parliament, like the Cabinet did earlier this morning, will want to express our solidarity with the people of Germany at this time. Presiding Officer, I'm pleased to have published today Scotland's place in Europe. This is a paper containing detailed and practical proposals to mitigate the very real economic, social, democratic and cultural risks that Scotland now faces as a result of the UK-wide referendum on EU membership in June. Let me be very clear. Brexit is a problem that is not of Scotland's making. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain within the European Union. And yet, notwithstanding the fact this problem is not of Scotland's making, this paper is actually the first and only detailed plan for dealing with the implications of Brexit to be published by any government in any part of the UK. 6 months on, the fact that there is still no clarity, no plan, no direction and no leadership from the UK government on an issue of such profound importance to every individual and every business across our country, quite frankly, beggars belief. This should be of particular concern to MSPs in this chamber, as there are many here who believe and who argued that the case for leave was sold on a false prospectus. As everyone knows, Presiding Officer, I believe Scotland should be an independent country. And as an independent country, that we should be full members of the EU. Indeed, if we were independent, we would not now be facing the situation of being taken out of the EU against our will. The manifesto on which I was elected as First Minister just 8 months ago said expressly in relation to independence that the Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. That change of circumstances has occurred, and there can therefore be no question about the legitimacy of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish people considering afresh the question of independence if that is necessary to protect our interests. I have made clear, and I do so again today, that the option of independence must remain on the table. Without this option, Scotland would simply have to accept the inevitability of whatever decisions the UK government makes, no matter how damaging they are to Scotland's interests. That is not a position, in my view, that any serious politician or party should ever be content for Scotland to be in. And as First Minister, it is my duty to ensure that all options are open to Scotland in these unprecedented times. However, as I've also made clear, independence is not the focus of the paper that we have published today. The paper we published earlier today is about fulfilling in full the commitment I made to the Scottish people in June. The day after the referendum, I promised to explore not just my preferred option of independence, but all options to protect Scotland's place in and relationship with Europe. This paper also delivers on the mandate that was given to this government by Parliament on the 28th of June to, and I quote, explore options for protecting Scotland's relationship with the EU, Scotland's place in the single market and the social, employment and economic benefits that come from that. I said specifically that we would seek to find a solution that would enable Scotland's voice to be heard and our interests protected from within the UK. This paper fulfils that commitment. Indeed, it goes further and sets out ways forward that I believe would also be in the interests of the rest of the UK and indeed in the interests of other European nations. Scotland's place in Europe sets out practical proposals to keep Scotland in the European single market. It also details the additional powers that the Scottish Parliament will need to serve, protect and promote Scotland's economic and social interests in the post-Brexit landscape. Now, let me be very clear. These proposals fall short of what I consider to be the best option for Scotland and for the UK, full membership of the European Union. In the unlikely event that the UK government had a change of heart and decides to remain in the EU, they would have my support. But that is clearly not an outcome in my gift. I'm therefore seeking to set out a sensible way forward for Scotland that respects the reality of the situation we find ourselves in. In that regard, these proposals represent a significant compromise on the part of the Scottish Government, not a high bar for the UK Government to pass. The proposals in this paper are a serious and a genuine attempt to build consensus, to square the circle created by the referendum result and to unify the country around a clear plan to protect our interests. I hope and expect that the UK Government, in considering these proposals, will demonstrate the same flexibility and willingness to compromise. I also hope that opposition parties will consider these proposals seriously. To those who say they want to protect Scotland's place in Europe, but won't get behind these proposals, the question will be, if not this plan, then what? Simply criticising the Scottish Government's proposals without coming up with alternatives will be tantamount to telling Scotland that it simply has to suck up whatever the Tory Brexit government at Westminster decides, no matter how damaging. Now, I suspect, they may prove me wrong, but I doubt it, I suspect that will be the position of the Scottish Conservatives. But it will be a much harder, I'd suggest impossible position for Labour and the Liberals to explain. Indeed. Let me turn now to the detail. Of the paper. It sets out in some considerable depth why keeping our place in the single market matters so much. It matters principally to our economy, to jobs, trade, living standards and investment. It is estimated that being outside the single market could cost the Scottish economy 80,000 jobs. Workers could lose £2,000 a year after a decade of a hard Brexit. Being in the single market also ensures protection for workers and consumer rights. It facilitates the flow of skills that our economy depends on and allows all of us to travel, work, study and live across Europe if we so wish. It will guarantee the rights of EU citizens already living here, something that disgracefully the UK Government has still not done 6 months on. And it provides a platform for cooperation on some of the major issues of our times, like climate change. The paper sets out the primary ways in which Scotland's place in the single market can be protected, and it has 3 principal strands. Firstly, we propose that the UK as a whole should stay in the single market by remaining a party to the European Economic Area Agreement, and that it should also stay in the customs union. It is important to remember that membership of the EU and of the single market are not one and the same. They are in fact 2 distinct propositions, as the position of 3 of the 4 EFTA countries demonstrates. Now, I accept there is a mandate in England and Wales to take the UK out of the EU. However, I don't accept that there is a mandate to take any part of the UK out of the single market. It would make no economic sense whatsoever for the UK to leave the single market. In fact, it would be economic folly of the highest order. And it would be entirely democratically justifiable for the UK to remain within the single market. So the Scottish Government will continue to argue and seek to build consensus with others of like mind across the UK for continued UK membership of the single market. However, I reluctantly accept that as things stand, given the rhetoric of the Conservative Government, that seems at this stage an unlikely outcome. The Tories, quite unbelievably in my view, seem intent on placing a higher priority on cutting immigration than on absolutely anything else. The economy, jobs, living standards all lag way behind on their list of priorities. As a result, the second strand of this paper proposes ways in which Scotland could stay in the single market through EFTA and the EEA, even if the rest of the UK chooses to leave. Now, the paper doesn't shy away from the challenges associated with such an option. On the contrary, the paper specifically identifies the key challenges that would be faced. For example, how continued membership of the single market could be achieved without Scotland being an independent country, the legislative and regulatory requirements, the issue of financial contributions, and the practical implications around free movement of goods, services and people. But crucially, it then sets out the basis of how each of these challenges could be overcome if the political will exists to do so. It's also very important to note, and I know that many across this chamber have emphasised this point, that this option does not prioritise membership of the EU single market over continued free trade across the UK. Talk of a hard border for Scotland has always rung hollow and will continue to do so from a UK government that says no such border will be required between a post-Brexit UK and the Republic of Ireland, a continuing member of the EU and customs union. But that argument aside, this paper sets out clearly how free movement of goods, services and people would continue across the UK, even with Scotland in the single market and the rest of the UK not. In that respect, it is worth emphasising that what we would propose would not see Scotland having a different relationship with the customs union to the rest of the UK. Now, we hope the UK will stay in the customs union. If it does so, then this proposal would enable Scotland to be in both the single market and the customs union. However, if the UK opts to leave the customs union, then Scotland, in common with other EFTA EEA countries, would not be in the customs union either. There will, of course, be disadvantages to Scottish business if we are not in the customs union, which is why I argue that the UK should stay in it, although those disadvantages would be minimised if Scotland remained in the single market. However, under this proposal, the border between Scotland and England would not be an external EU customs border. What is in effect a customs union now between Scotland and the rest of the UK would continue. Now, there will be those who say, I know, that a differentiated option for Scotland, such as the one we propose, would be too difficult to achieve. And as I have said already, this paper does not underestimate the challenges. However, I think it is important, in response to that suggestion, to consider these 3 points. Firstly, it is the case that there are already today a range of asymmetric and differential arrangements in operation within the EU and single market framework. Denmark, Greenland, the Faroe Islands is one, the Channel Islands another. There are many others. The solution we seek for Scotland would be different, of course, in detail and scale to many of these arrangements, but it would not be different in principle. Secondly, the UK Government already appears open to a flexible Brexit approach in relation to different sectors of the economy, as we have already seen in their approach to Nissan. It will also be necessary to take a flexible approach in relation to Northern Ireland and to Gibraltar. There is, quite simply, no good reason why such flexibility should not also apply to Scotland. And lastly, as we are now seeing on an almost daily basis, everything about Brexit will be difficult, challenging and unprecedented. The negotiations ahead will be characterised in all respects, particularly if the UK does intend to leave the single market and customs union, by a need to find practical solutions to a whole range of complex issues. So it is in that spirit that we seek to find solutions that will respect the voice and protect the interests of Scotland. Presiding Officer, the final strand of this paper deals with the powers of this Scottish Parliament. It is, in my firm view, time for a fundamental reconsideration of the devolution settlement in light of Brexit. The paper argues that in light of the removal of rights and responsibilities provided by EU law, and whatever the outcome of the Brexit negotiations, Scotland's interests within the UK demand considerably enhanced and strengthened powers for this Parliament. So the paper we've published today looks at 3 broad categories of powers that must now be considered. Firstly, it looks at the powers set to be repatriated from the EU, which currently sit within Scottish Parliament responsibility. For example, fishing, the environment, justice and agriculture. Now, I hope all members will agree unreservedly that these powers must remain firmly and unambiguously within devolved competence. If there is a need to agree UK-wide arrangements on any matter, for example, such as animal welfare, that must be done by agreement, not by imposition. Brexit must not become an excuse for a Westminster power grab. Secondly, powers to be repatriated that are not currently devolved should also now be considered for devolution. Powers in areas such as employment law and social protection would allow this Parliament to protect key rights and avoid the risk of a deregulated race to the bottom by Westminster. And thirdly, a much broader range of powers to protect Scotland's interests and support a differentiated solution of the kind proposed in this paper must also be considered. For example, power over immigration. Indeed, it is worth noting, I think, that growing support across the UK for greater flexibility over immigration is now increasingly being expressed. Presiding Officer, in short, the proposals in this paper are detailed, they are serious and they are reasonable. They are designed deliberately and unashamedly to respect Scotland's voice and protect our interests, while also acknowledging and respecting the vote in other parts of the UK and the position the UK Government now finds itself in as a result. Let me now briefly set out how we intend to take these proposals forward. We accept absolutely that the negotiation that will start on the triggering of Article 50 will be a negotiation between the UK and the EU. We are not seeking a separate parallel negotiation with EU institutions or member states. That is why these proposals are aimed first and foremost at the UK Government. We want the UK Government to make clear when it triggers Article 50 that it intends to stay in the single market and the customs union. If it will not do so, we want the UK Government to seek, as part of its negotiation, a differentiated solution for Scotland as set out in this paper. We will submit these proposals formally to the UK Government through the Joint Ministerial Committee framework for discussion in the new year. I intend that this Parliament will continue to be involved and informed at every step of the way, as it has been already through 11 parliamentary debates to date on different aspects of Brexit. The Prime Minister, when I met her in Edinburgh in July, pledged to fully and fairly consider the proposals we brought forward. She repeated that commitment without reservation when I spoke to her yesterday, and I welcome that. Presiding Officer, it is beyond any doubt whatsoever that the Brexit vote, with its different outcomes in different parts of the UK, has raised fundamental questions for all of us. It has raised fundamental questions about our relationship with Europe, but it has also raised fundamental questions about how political power is exercised across the UK. So to the Westminster Government, my message could not be clearer. Your response to these proposals will tell us much. Perhaps it will tell us everything we need to know about whether the UK is in reality the partnership of equals that you claim it to be. To our European partners, I want today to reaffirm our belief in and our commitment to the core values of solidarity, cooperation and democracy that underpin the European Union. And to the people of Scotland, I pledge this. I will continue to do everything I can to protect your interests as we navigate the challenging times ahead.